making it work. In this lesson, we're going to continue where we left off last time with our carousel JavaScript functions. So far, we've put together a skeleton of functions. Let's make them work. To get started, open the Module 4 code file and look for folder 04 start. A completed version of this lesson's code is in the folder 04 end. We begin by opening our Carousel.js file in the JavaScripts folder. When we set up our code last lesson, we put in an interval that will run every 4 seconds and will run a function called showNextQuote. Let's start with that. In the showNextQuote function block, let's work out what this needs to do. First, it needs to know what the next current item is going to be. What we're doing here is working out what quote, referenced by its index, or number in sequence, we'd like to show. That's simple enough. It'll either be the current index plus 1, unless the current quote is the last, in which case we want to loop back to number 0. We can write this as so. This means that if the current item is the last one, it'll set the current index to 0. Otherwise, it'll simply add 1 to the current index value. That's what the plus plus stands for. It's a shorthand way of saying current index plus 1. We can then call our updateState function and pass it that number. We are saying update the state with the current quote being number current index. Let's next create our function that lets us show a specific quote, showQuote. What we want to do here is get the index of the quote being selected. It'll likely be either the previous or next quote, but we're not going to assume that those are the only quotes that will be potentially clickable. Instead, we'll work out the index for the clicked quote, and again pass that to the updateState function. We begin by checking if the clicked item has the class quote. If it does, great. Let's assign that to the variable target. If not, it must be a child item of the quote, so let's get the immediate parent and apply that to the variable target instead. We can now use the jQuery index helper. This will tell us what index value our target quote has within the set of quotes. It says select all quotes and run the index method looking for our target. This returns a number we'll pass into our handy updateState function. We've now written 2 functions that will both work in a similar way. They work out the index of the quote we'd like to show and give this index value to updateState. Let's write that now. What we'd like to do here is use the given index value to work out a value for the previous and next quotes, and then update the visible carousel items to reflect this new state. We begin by calculating new values for the prev index, current index, and next index global variables. We set these values to 0, 1, and 2 up at the top, and they represent the state of the carousel. Let's update them. First, we'll work out the prev index. We can use a ternary statement here. In case you haven't seen this before, a ternary is a way of putting an if-else into one line. It's useful when you want to choose between 2 values based on a comparison. In this case, we're saying if the given index is 0, return the last item, otherwise return the index minus 1. We then set the current index to the given index value. Next, we calculate the next index by using another ternary. This time we say If the given index is equal to the last quote, then set it to 0. Otherwise, use the value of our given index plus 1. Now that we've established our new carousel state, we'll call a function that updates the visible carousel items, updateCarousel We also want to set the special left item that will animate in from the left side if we were to click the previous carousel item. Our soon-to-be-written setLeftClass will handle that. Next, we update the pips using updatePips. These three functions all act on the current state of the carousel, which we updated when we updated the 3 index values. Now that we've updated the state, let's actually apply the previous, current, and next classes to our HTML. We'll do this in the function updateCarouselPosition. We begin by removing any previous, current, or next classes from the quotes. This clears the way, and we can now set new classes. Before we can apply the classes, we need an array of all the quotes. We'll create this as the array allQuotes, containing all items with class quote inside the carousel. Now that we have an array, we can simply apply classes using our index values. We can pass into the jQuery object the quote at index position prevIndex and add class previous. Same for current index and next index. Let's take a moment to check our progress. We've created quite a few functions so far, so let's load it in the browser and check that 2 things are working. Firstly, that it's automatically moving forward to the next quote every few seconds. And secondly, that we can select the previous and next quotes and see them. If it's not working for you, open your browser's inspector and look for any errors in the Console tab. You might have a typo. If you're like me, that's a fairly likely possibility. If you're still stuck, you can look at the code in the folder 04end. It's often a good idea to jump across to the browser when coding to check nothing's breaking and that things are taking shape as expected. If all is looking well, let's move on and set up the progress indicator. Let's take a look at the next function, in which we'll generate the progress indicator pips for the bottom of the screen. Before we create this function, we'll want to go to our index.html file and update the list of pip items. We remove all the li items and leave just the ul container. We'll fill this using JavaScript. Back in our carousel.js file, let's write the generatePips function. We begin by finding the list container item on the page. In this case, it's the ul tags we left earlier. We'll then use a for loop to create and append new pip items until we've hit the last item in the carousel. We set the variable I to the last index. Then as long as this is greater than or equal to 0, we keep subtracting 1 each time. Inside the loop, we'll create a new pip list item and give it the class pip. We put this into the list container using the jQuery append method. Lastly, outside the for loop, we'll run a function to apply the appropriate previous, current, and next classes for our pips. Let's write that next. In this updatePips function, we want to set the previous, current, and next classes on the relevant pips. In this function, we begin by removing the relevant classes within the Carousel pips element. We then get an array of all the pips and use the same approach as earlier, setting the previous, current, and next classes based on their index. Let's take a look in the browser to check this is working. We see the pips generated by JavaScript and the classes have been applied. We're almost done. Let's next write the code to help us show specific quotes when people click on one of the pips. This function is passed an event, which contains as a target the item clicked. We can use this target to find the index of the clicked pip from within the set of list items. We then pass the index into the updateState function, which will set the carousel state, update the positions of the quotes, and even update the pips. Let's quickly test this to see it working. It's looking good. However, there's one thing more to fix. Notice how the previous item flies away to the right when it's being removed or added. We need to create a function that applies our special left class to these quotes. Before we wrap up the initial version of our carousel, let's fix this left issue. We want the item before the previous item to have this special left class, so that it moves to and from a position over to the left side of the carousel. To do this, we'll first get an array of all the quotes so that we can access them by index. We then clear out any previous left classes. Next, we want to find the quote before the previous quote. If the previous index is greater than 0, then that'll mean we can just decrement the prev index by 1. We then apply the class left to this index in the all quotes array. Otherwise, if the prev index is actually 0, then we want this left item to be the last in the array. We have our handy last index global value we can use to apply this class to the last item. When we press the previous item on first load, the new quote swings across from the right side. We can fix this by running setLeftClass at the initial load of the page. We'll add it under the generatePips function call. Let's do a final check of the progress so far. It's looking very good. Clicking on the quotes navigates back and forth. They loop nicely, and selecting the pips lets us jump to a specific quote. This was a big lesson, and we've covered a lot. We put together a quite complex piece of JavaScript that lets us interact with our content, triggering animations by changing classes in our HTML. We did it by putting together chains of small functions, all based around the idea of a state for the carousel. In the next lesson, we're going to look into ways we can make the carousel pause and then resume when people interact with it. We'll also look at how we can have it pause when the browser's tab is out of view.